So the underlying intent is to be able to understand how someone is making meaning and what reality do they see. One way we can look at the meta-crisis is that there's an underlying myth of separation. We could call it a metamythic attractor. There's a story, a narrative that's rooted in separation that is sort of guiding how we live and what we do.
Sure.
And so we can say here that the underlying intention is to be able to understand, firstly and simply, that everyone is in a different reality. Even though we seem to be in the same world, we see different things. And not only that, we have a different perspective on those things that we can see. And so first, if we just can admit that we don't all live in the same world and that the way that I see things is not the way that things are. This is Ken Wilber's myth of the given.
Right.
We can recognize that the way I see things is not the way things are. It then brings the next question. Well, how do you see things? What reality do you live in? What's important to you? And so by understanding these confluence of these three questions, I'm not so interested in what stage someone is at, as I've mentioned. I'm more interested in what range of meaning making is someone moving through. But the deeper intent is to understand someone more deeply so that I can love them more precisely. And I can show them that I care in a way that feels meaningful to them.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Integral Edge through Integral Life. My name is Keith Martin Smith, and I am the author most recently of When the Buddha Needs Therapy. And I am here with my friend and colleague, Alexander Love, who is a coach, and he's also a senior facilitator at the Neufeld Network, right?
Yeah.
And you work as an acupuncturist and a coach and sort of an integrative specialist where you really bring a lot of, I would say, whole body, whole mind, soul, shadow work together with your clients.
Yeah.
And
Glad to be here.
I've been a client of Alexander's and can definitely speak to his magical powers and powers of perception. And we are both connected around this theory of Terry O'Fallon's called stages. And today, what I really want to explore is putting stages into sort of a broader historical context of developmental models that have been out there for, 90, 80, 70, 60 years. And then really talking about one of the reasons and some of the reasons that I find the model really incredibly useful and powerful as a tool in my own practice, in my own life. And I know, Alexander, you use it a lot in your practice and in your life. And so that's really what the conversation is going to be about today. So, hi, Alexander. Good to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Really happy to be here to explore this with you and everybody.
Great. So for people that aren't super familiar with stages, it's I would say, really, we would put it in the same family as a lot of the other developmental models that would include like Jane Lovinger and Robert Keegan and Suzanne Kreuter. And Terry's model really focuses mostly on the cognitive line of development, so more than, say, the relational or the somatic or any of the other lines of intelligence. And it, like these other models, is really a subject-object model where each developmental stage progresses when the thing that a person is subject to, say magical thinking, becomes an object in the next phase of development where we have magical thinking. So, obviously I can imagine fantastical scenarios as an author and write about them, but I'm not writing only from magical thinking. And so what I find interesting about Terry's model, like Suzanne's and Keegan's and some other ones, is that they really don't just talk about the idea of development as quantum levels where, one day you're Bob Keegan's 3.0 and on Monday and Tuesday you're Keegan's 4.0. It's nowhere near that neat. It's nowhere near that clean. Development is messy. I think Keegan writes about the idea that, roughly speaking, we have a center of gravity where roughly 50% of our cognitive decisions are made, and we may have a quarter that's on the leading edge and a quarter that's dragging behind. I think the research in the last maybe 2 decades has also pointed out, like through Kim Barta, who is Terry O'Fallon's brother, that there can be things like shadow crashes where, maybe like for me personally, I grew up in a sort of a corporal Catholic environment. And so if I'm exposed to sort of rules and regulations that my mature self finds confining or unfair, I might collapse down into an earlier developmental stage and react from that place rather than my fully differentiated, consciousness when I'm well rested and have a good perspective on things. And the model really, I think one of the ways that it serves us most powerfully is it allows us the capacity to actually, from a heart place, to look at people and how they generate meaning and make sure that when we're speaking and communicating to others, whether they be clients or family or friends or children, or our children, that we're actually understanding how they make meaning and meeting them there rather than doing what most of us do, which is speak over the heads of other people, presuming that they make meaning the way we do. So for me, stages like these other models is really a great tool of empathy and connection and communication. And with that, I'm going to knock it over to you, Alexander, and just have me tell you what you think about all this stuff.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. I think that it's become common or popular in developmental circles to sort of look at stages like stair steps. I was here and then now I'm more advanced, and those people are less advanced, and I'm trying to get to the next higher level. And we have words that we use like levels. There's a higher level, there's a lower level. And I think that there's a potential within stages to really help um, redefine the narrative around how we understand what development is. It's not that those things are untrue. I mean, we do go through stages of development, but I think that in Terry's conception of it, we're looking at a whole. I like to call them developmental waves. There's these 12 developmental waves of the human whole, and there's a way in which that as we grow up, we're also automatically unfolding what came before it. And I mean, we say an integral, transcendent, include, but I often hear that transcendent include is like a parenthesis afterthought. After,
Right.
after we say something like, "Oh, I'm more advanced than everybody," of course we don't say it directly. I'm more advanced than everybody, and then, oh, by the way, transcendent include. I think that there's more that we can do to really unfold. Like right now, you and I are using things that we developed as a newborn. I'm hearing with my concrete ears. We're sensing each other. We're at a very concrete level. We're literally using those aspects of the human whole while we're operating from a different place. And so I think that, Terry's model has the potential to really help illuminate. One way to say it is that, all of the developmental waves are one gesture. They're one unfolding process that are essentially a continuity.
Yeah. 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 And I think what happens, I mean, certainly it happened to me, and I certainly see this in the integral community, which is, when you first learn about this model, and it answers so many questions, so many things you've struggled with, in your life, interpersonally and personally, that it can be a little hard, as I was saying to you before this call started, it can be hard not to become an insufferable integralist where you sort of run all of reality through this frame, and especially all people through the frame. And you do a lot of sort of back of napkin guessing about the development that people may be operating from, often being incorrect and often generating some unpleasant opinions towards yourself in the process. So
Yeah.
maybe we could talk about the methodology a little of stages as you understand it, and sort of, how it works, how these different, the 12 stages, or the 12, what did you call them in your
12 waves of development.
12 ways? Yeah, how these 12 waves of development, like some of the ways that we are able to differentiate one from another.
Yeah, so I think what you're bringing is a really good point. That very often what I see in developmental communities that love integral is that we learn these different stages, and they often have a different color, and we learn the different sort of ways that they might show up. And this can sometimes lead to looking at people as though they're a sort of a caricature. It's like, oh, well, if you're postmodern, then you probably are wearing patchouli, or
Right.
it's like, I'm oversimplifying, but I see this all the time. And what I notice in that sort of way of being with this kind of material, this developmental material, is that we lack precision. We lack precision, often because we are trying to fit the content that we observe in someone into a pre-existing developmental box. Now, what Terry's model offers is a deep structure of how developmental waves are formed, which allows us to let go of a lot of the content uh, and really listen to what are the underlying, in Terry's language, the underlying parameters that someone is expressing. That a way to say this is that Terry's model, in its sort of an essence of Terry's model, it holds the deep structure of evolution. And so we're listening to how is the unfolding of evolution speaking through another human being in a very precise and elegant way. This allows us to kind of cut through the sort of content related, I'm going to turn you into a archetype of some sort of way I think you should look. You should have a suit on and have a briefcase, or you should be wearing patchouli and have tie dye.
Right. Right.
It really helps us cut through all that and see the deeper structure of the developmental unfolding.
I mean, I love your saying this. This has been a big part of the last, couple months of conversations I've had with a number of different integralists, which is this idea of the structure content fallacy. And a colleague of mine, David Arell's spoken about it and written about it quite extensively. And it sounds like just what you're saying, this idea that if I was to say to you, like, well, Alexander, I think Trump is really making some necessary changes and, glad that I voted for him. Something that I'm not saying I said that, but if I said that,
Yeah.
the content, right? If you were a typical integralist, you would say, Trump, he wants change. Okay, so he's amber or he's orange, right? Because you're going to presume, whereas you would, what would you ask if I said that to sort of help suss out the level?
Yeah. So maybe what we can do is to kind of break down Terry's model a little bit in its sort of central parts. The first question that I would ask is what's the world space that they are witness to? What's the ontological reality that they can see?
Mm.
And Terry has 3 tiers. Each tier you can look at like its own world space. And each world space has access to a different answer to the question, what is reality? So we have the first tier, which is the concrete tier. These are things like apples, fish, children. There are, we look at something called sort of the concrete emotions. These are the emotions that you can easily see on someone's face. Any baby can have anger, fear, surprise, things like that. And then also within that concrete tier, we can get more nuanced as we grow up and start looking at rules and roles. These can seem a little more abstract, and they are compared to apples, but they can have a kind of, the rules are you don't hit your friend. They're very concrete in nature. So we have that concrete world space. Then we have a subtle world space. Now things become more refined, like I'm sensing subtle energy, or I can envision a future that doesn't exist yet, or I'm able to see that I'm connected to this group of people through one context, but I'm connected to this other group of people through a different context, and then we all share a third context. There's sort of these threads, invisible threads of connection that are harder to see than all of your family members at the dinner table.
Right.
And then we have the third tier, which is the meta-aware tier, and things get more subtle, very subtle things, starting
Right.
to be aware of awareness and starting to be aware of cross-paradigmatic interweaving between multiple traditions, looking at a trajectory of the whole cosmos as one unfolding sense of identity. And so anyway, that would be the first question that I would be holding when someone's speaking. Well,
Right.
are they seeing a subtle world space, a subtle reality? Are they seeing only a concrete reality? Are they seeing a metaware and a subtle and a concrete reality? So that would be my first question. Now, the cool thing is that each of these tiers has 4 waves of development in each tier.
Right.
So in terms of precision, even if we just got good at recognizing
three.
what's the ontological reality that you have access to, you've now just narrowed down 12 stages into 4, which is
Right.
right. Because we now know if you can see a subtle world, well, then you're somewhere between those 4 subtle stages. If you can just see a concrete world, you're somewhere within those 4 concrete stages. This becomes already a very
Right.
precise tool to narrow us into
Right. Right.
where someone's coming from.
And if you're an adult, if you're working with an adult, then, in the concrete, you're really very likely only talking about 2 of the 3. Sorry, 2 of the 4, because, because
Most likely, unless you're
barring,
unless you're working in prisons or
Yep.
in people that have had a lot of deep-seated trauma and
Well, so that's really interesting. And I love that, like, the model says that for someone that is, I guess, amber and integral, or 3.0 in Keegan, or 2.5 or 2.0 in Terry's model, but they see the future, they can only see the future as a continuation of the past. So if we talk to a fundamentalist Christian who's not, then we're not confusing our content with our structure, but someone who really believes the literal word of God and believes in some sort of a second coming, and believes you follow the rules or you go to hell, etc. You ask them about the future. Their future is going to be a continuation of the past, imagined forward in time, because they don't have the developmental structure to imagine a future that's different from the past. Is that accurate? Am I saying that accurately?
Yeah, absolutely. Terry will say it like you put the past in front of you, or another way we hear this is like, oh, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? If we're talking to an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, oh, I want to be a firefighter.
Right.
And what's not yet happening is sort of an envisioning of something that doesn't exist yet. It's taking the concrete reality that I've had experience with already and saying, well, I'm going to put that in front of me, and that's what my future is going to be.
Right. Okay. So you assess these 3 things. And, one of the things that I find interesting also about Terry's model, and I guess this would really be true for Robert Keegan's and Suzanne's as well, but I've just studied Terry's more. But this idea that as we go through the concrete, the subtle begins in Terry's model with moving from what will be amber in the integral parlance to umber, right? So it'd be moving from strictly role defined and defined by group and a group identity to beginning to ask the question, who am I outside of a group? Right. That's the moving stage into what will be early rational or early orange, right? This umber phase. Where I'm beginning to imagine a future that is beyond what I've been told is possible and is defined by the structures that I've been told make up the cosmos.
That's right.
That's
right. So, right, exactly. So one of the things we see is that as someone progresses through a particular world space, the first thing that they do is they develop their individual identity. So there's 2 waves that are dedicated to that. So we have 1.0 and 1.5. This is the emerging and the maturing aspect of the first person perspective, or my identity as an individual. Once I have a degree of maturity as an individual, then as a concrete individual, then I begin to interact with a collective. And so this is where Terry's weaving in some of Ken Wilber's work in the 4 quadrants, where, okay, now that my individual concrete identity has come to a degree of fruition, I'm now able to enter into the concrete collective. And that too has an emerging stage, 2.0, and then a maturing stage, 2.5. So once I get to 2.5, I have a a well-rounded, hopefully, in the context of developmental wellness, I have a well-rounded maturation of the concrete individual and the concrete collective as features of my identity.
Right.
Once that occurs, it gives rise for a transition into a new world. So the ceiling of maturity that I have entered into, I now poke through that ceiling, and I'm
Mm.
now looking at the ground floor of a new world space. And so I now enter that new world space as a brand new individual, like a newborn, but now in the subtle world. So I'm able to look back and start to create some differentiation between this emerging identity and the sort of the concrete collective of rule and role orientation. But in transitions, as transitions go, I tend to sort of flow back and forth.
Right. As we were saying, it's not a quanta, it's a fluid process, and over a reasonably long arc of time,
Yeah,
the emergent self begins to stabilize, right?
exactly.
And I think for most of us, that would be on this call or watching this, we probably remember that first big transition where we went from really being identified with a 2.5 or amber identity, where our identity was the group, to the rather painful transition as we sort of, for a lot of us, maybe grade school, high school, as we begin to come into, well, who am I outside of the group? While also being very aware of the group dynamics and, things like conformity and peer pressure and wanting to look cool and wanting to be cool. And yet there's this emergent self that is wanting to really create a future and an identity that is transcending from any group identity. And that process is, we usually remember adolescence because it kind of sucks in some ways.
Yeah, yeah, and we can see this sort of an archetypal expression of this in the leaving home and going to college kind of dynamic where we're leaving behind all the things that we learned from our parents and we decided were true, and now we're engaging in an environment where teachers are inviting us to think for ourselves, think outside of the box. What do we care about? At the same time, we're also navigating. There's certain colleges that feel like old high school. We're still navigating the concrete collective because that's the only collective we have access to so far until we go into 4.0 and 4.5. And so we're navigating both this exploration of the individual, the subtle individual, but we're also still navigating that concrete collective, which now may not look like our parents, but maybe it looks like our new friend group.
Right.
um,
Or the sorority or the fraternity, which
or
would be
this.
like very appropriate developmental bridges, right? Because it's
That's right.
like, it's still a conformist group, but it's one that I've chosen to go into. So
Exactly. And
there's
so
a degree of autonomy, right, that's potentially happening.
that's right. And so if we put these two together, we now have the first and second question,
Mm.
which helps us in our precision of getting to the deep structure of the stage. We have the question of what world space or world spaces do you have access to? Once we know that, we have narrowed down 12 waves of development to 4. But then we can say, well, what's your preference in terms of the way that you're in relationship to the world? Are you more coming from a place where you're exploring your individual identity, or are you exploring a collective
Right.
identity? And we have preferences like a 2-year-old, they're more foregrounding an individual identity. That's my cookie. Give me my cookie. What I care about is me getting what I want. Whereas 8-year-old 2.0, there's friendship, there's sharing, there's patty cake, there's a collective preference. So now, once we can get a sense of this person we're talking to who said they voted for Trump, just to use your earlier example, they voted for Trump, they're glad they did, then we can ask this question, well, what's their orientation preference in terms of collective or individual? This now
Right.
narrows down 4 to 2
Because
because
I could say that I really believe that too much taxes for me and too much me, or I could say, well, look what's happening in the world, look what's happening with our borders, the way, so you can sort of start to parse out what might be an individual focus and care or a collective
yeah,
focus and care.
That's right. And as I
Okay.
mentioned, the first two stages of every tier are the emergence and maturation of an individual in that world. And then the second two stages within every tier are going to be an emergence and a maturation of a collective in that world. And so now we've narrowed it down from 12 to 2 with just two questions.
Right.
And
Right.
so it becomes a very uh, the thing that um, that has stood out most to me about Terry Stage's model is its usefulness with real people in a coaching context, in a coffee shop. Now, I'm not suggesting that other models are also not effective. I don't know them to the depth to be able to say anything. But I had studied integral for years. I was,
Mhm.
had learned about spiral dynamics and these different models. And when I learned Terry's model, I was like, I can use this in a practical way, because in a way there's a simplicity to it, even though there's a profound complexity to it at this
Right.
time.
Right. And so what's your preference? So the first question is, what's the world space? Concrete, subtle, meta-aware.
Mhm.
And then if we're reasonably sure there, then we have 4 waves or 4 stages that are in each one of those.
Mhm.
And then those have a social preference, which is either individual or collective.
Mhm.
Am I
Yes.
parroting that back accurately? Okay.
Mhm.
Um, and so one of the things that I find interesting as we talk about the subtle space is that the subtle space begins with what Terry and Suzanne call the expert, or what an integral, which would be the umber, right? Amber exit, orange entrance, and then moves through Terry's 3.5, or the achiever, I think, in her model. And that would be full blown rationality, logic, science, the idea of being aware of things like cognitive bias, and being able to see that that happens, having this sort of so-called third person perspective where there's this objective reality, an objective thing that I can look at and reflect upon. Um, and that creates obviously tremendous power of the mind, to be able to see and parse and understand reality and people and all these things. And, but at 3.5 orange, we can be aware, and help me understand this better. My understanding is that we can be aware of what I would call more concrete traumas, like overt PTSD, or, shell shock, back in the First World War, um, or, really bad alcoholism, or different addictions, sort of things that are sort of very easy for people to see and discern with their immediate senses and pick up that, like, Keith isn't doing very well. There's something going on. Maybe it's related to, maybe he should get some therapy. So there's an ability to really see sort of a wide field of obvious trauma, but it's much harder to see subtler forms of trauma. Is that how you would understand Orange or 3.5? So if we're talking about internal
Yeah.
family systems, parts,
Well,
an inner child, uh, things like this.
yeah. So, um, 3.5 has the ability for what we might call metacognition. So
Mhm.
that means that I can look at sadness and feel sad about it. So I can feel about my feelings. I can look at some thought patterns. I can have thoughts about how I'm going about thinking. Let's look at how we're thinking about this. So 3.5 is able to do that. Now, what I would say in terms of internal family systems, 3.5 can learn how to do internal IFS. People are doing parts work with little children,
Yeah. Right.
using toys, and you can walk somebody through uh, an IFS or a parts work process at 3.5, absolutely. But they're not going to come up with a system like IFS. That's going to require a fourth person perspective at least. Because once you get into the subtle collective, 4.0, 4.5, the fourth person perspective, here's where we can start to see um, subtler relationships that a part of the self, it's not just my thoughts and feelings, but there's a part of me that has thoughts and feelings and impulses. From a 4.5 perspective, we can see it's a whole little system. And so 3.5 isn't going to necessarily have that kind of nuance, but they may be more apt to look at this like, oh, the sadness in me or the anger in me, if they're guided, because
Yeah.
they're able to reflect on their feelings and reflect on their thoughts. Yeah.
Right. So metacognition versus metasystemic thinking, would that be sort of an accurate differentiator between 3.5 and 4.0, which is green, for people that
Yeah.
are
So
familiar with
so
that model?
4.0 yeah, 4.0 can start to see systems, but they're had by them, right? So they'll notice that there's systemic oppression, but
Yeah.
there's a way in which they're still inside the system. So because they're an emerging subtle collective, they're inside the system. They're not able to stand back from it, as you pointed out with subject object. They can't stand back from the system and start to actively manipulate it. They can see that there's systemic oppression and that they're going to feel that we're all had by it. Whereas 4.5 can step back from that and say, okay, there's a system here. How do we want to tweak the system in dynamic ways to support a systemic shift?
Okay. So now we're getting into real beautifully complex territory. So if we look at something that I've spoken about a lot, like, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we
Mhm.
talk about this idea of, okay, from a from a 3.0 expert stage, they're going to see that, okay, we need to have these external systems that ensure that people are being equitable. And if we see any injustice in the world as far as unequal representation of, say, women in the workforce or people of color or people of different gender backgrounds, the cause has to be oppression. And we need to do whatever means is necessary to get equal representation. So they're going to be looking at it through a lens that is um, uh, not terribly sophisticated and perhaps quite inaccurate.
So 3.0 and 3.5 are going to start caring about human rights. But there's more of a focus on the exteriors, such as the physical gender, right?
What
So
you can see with your senses.
what you can see with your gender. So there's a conflation of sex and gender. So what they're really seeing are the sex, the biological body. Um, Men should be treated equally as women and vice versa. Um, so basically the color of your skin, everybody should be treated equally. Once you get into the fourth person perspective, there becomes more nuance and a pluralistic sort of capacity for understanding. Well, wait a minute, sex and gender aren't the same thing. You
Right.
can have your body biologically be one thing, but then there might be a whole spectrum of genders on the interior that you identify with. And so you're going to start seeing nuances in terms of understanding what quote unquote human rights means.
Right. And I think I think you may have mentioned this to me, something about using school children as an example of how they hold some of these things. Say grade school kids, or right. So they're under, maybe you could just repeat that, like sort of their understanding of DEI from what would be either a 2.5 amber or probably 3.0
Yeah,
expert or umbra phase would look like. Because I think it's
exactly.
important,
So
because I think it gets really, this is the content structure fallacy. It gets really confused when we look at the world and see people talking about things. It's like not what they're saying, but from where are they saying it.
exactly. So like, my daughter in middle school, she's surrounded by teachers and family members that have at least a fourth person perspective capacity. So there's a general inclusion of all genders. So as that conversation has become more popular, the school had took that on. And so, on the first day of middle school, the kids were supposed to introduce themselves and their pronouns.
Right.
Right. And so what will happen is there's a kind of gender inclusivity and recognition of spectrum that's coming from the fourth person perspective, 4.0 and 4.5. But then it gets adopted by kids that are more 2.0, 2.5. And so you might see a kid, my daughter was like this, where, now being inclusive is the rule. And if you slip up and accidentally use the wrong pronoun, you're in trouble. because you broke
Right.
the rules. And we
Right.
all know. Now, as we move beyond the concrete collective, there now becomes there comes an individual, subtle individual that starts to come online that's now able to have some distance, not a lot. 3.0 is fluctuating back and forth, but some distance between understanding this as a rule orientation and maybe I'm starting to find my own ideas, come up with my own ideas about what human rights should look like. That's maybe different than what my postmodern parents and teachers told me
Right.
uh, it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's so fascinating. I mean, I'm smiling because I'm thinking of Robert Keegan wrote about years ago how, he would work with parents who were horrified that they were in a place like, Boulder or the Bay, and they had moved to someplace like Texas or Arkansas. An 8-year-old little Johnny would go from being just full of these wonderful postmodern ideas of equality to being a little racist, right? They
That's
couldn't
right.
figure out what happened. And his
Yeah.
whole thing was, little Johnny doesn't hold your postmodern values of equality in anything approaching a postmodern view of equality. He holds them in a completely rule-based, absolute way, and he would metaphorically burn someone at the cross for not being kind and
That's right.
equitable,
That's
right?
right. And so
That's
if
the
we look,
irony.
that's right. And if we look at
Mm,
this through Terry's model, likely what happened to this, I think you said Johnny, what likely happened to Johnny is he moves into a new territory. He was owning a 2.5 sort of certainty. And then he went into a new environment, felt a little more insecure. It awakened more of a 2.0, where he's now, instead of being in his mature, I know the rules, I know what we
right,
are, I know what we believe, he went to an earlier wave where now he is in a newly emerging 2.0 collective. He did it once, but now he has to do it again.
right, right,
And so he's now in this, when we're in an emerging phase, a 0.0, we're usually had by whatever is occurring. And so now he's with all these people and he wants to belong more than anything else. And so he's had by the new rules until he then takes on, okay, now I know the truth. We're not inclusive anymore or whatever it is. Now we believe this other thing.
right, right. Okay, that's very, very helpful. Right, the point 0 versus the point 0.5. Well, and then 4.0 or green is, as many of us have experienced, it is, as you said, they can be had by what they see in the sense of the capacity, as we acknowledge, I guess there are systemic issues. There is systemic sexism, there is systemic racism, there are systemic injustices. The reality of that is fairly obvious to anyone who sort of looks at the data. And yet the truth is very, very, very complicated, right? As I've spoken about a number of times, but the truth is complicated in that the difference between oppression and naturally chosen differences can be hard to parse out. And one has to be very aware, not just of cognitive bias, but of all kinds of different biases and different projections and different um, presumptions about what may cause differences between people. And what I understand the 4.0 green to be really terrible at is being able, what may be incapable of, but is to being able to appreciate that human reality is created by us creating frameworks of understanding that we then look through the same way I'm looking through this window right behind my computer.
Mhm.
The window helps define what I see. It's a frame, but if I look through this window, I see something very, very different. It's a different frame.
Yeah.
And is it accurate to say that it's at 4.5 or teal that the capacity to see and understand that we are in some ways had by our frames begins to come online?
Yeah, so 4.0 recognizes that we're socially constructed and can understand that, 3.5 can understand that I have an observer. I can
Right.
I can
Right.
reflect on my thoughts and feelings and be like, okay, I'm thinking like this, and that's going to make me act in a certain way, and it's going to get me certain results. So, even 3.5, there's a sense of I can see a kind of a frame. But what 4.5 is able to do is begin to see that these frames are nested along a continuum of development, that some perspectives are better than others in certain contexts. It doesn't
Right.
mean that this perspective is always better than this perspective. It's able to hold the dynamism of shifting contexts.
The relative nature of reality without collapsing into nihilism or deconstruction.
Right. It's able to see that, oh, in this context, a 2.0 perspective is most suited, because what you need is for me to just hold your hand and tell you I'm glad you're here.
All right.
Right. Whereas in this other context, there's let's engage in a 3.5 debate of ideas to support and nurture the sort of living dynamism in this college student who's trying to sort out what they believe and take a position and hold that position and come up with data that supports it. And so that's what 4.5 is able to do. Later in 4.5, they're also able to recognize their own projections upon reflection.
Right. Right. And I want to
4.0
get to
can,
that. Yeah.
yeah, I was just going to say 4.0 can recognize when other people are projecting. This is
Right.
why gaslighting has become such a popular phrase.
Right.
4.5, but they can't recognize it as well when they're doing it.
Well, of course, people don't say like, boy, I really gaslit the shit out of that person the other day. It's like, you don't
Right.
see a lot of posts about that, right?
Right, exactly.
But the one thing I did notice in
Yeah.
integral circles when I first started spending time with them was there was, in some ways, a healthy obsession with projection, because I think noticing our own projection became a newfound reality that you sort of became like, well, wait, Alexander, am I projecting onto you? Can you just, can we reality confirm that? No? Okay, great. I just want to make sure, you know.
Exactly, because what we'll see, and this really brings us to the third question, which is looking at the right side of Terry's model, which she talks about as a learning sequence, or like our preferred learning sequence. I like to think about it as evolution's engine. It's the driver of the whole model, and I guess what maybe I'll do is just back up for a minute and go through that, and then talk about projection in that context. So there are, in every tier, there are 4 of these learning styles, or these 4 parameters. The first one
And
is
I'm just going to pause you and say every
yeah,
tier being concrete, subtle, meta-aware,
that's right.
just so we can
Exactly.
remind people. And then in each one of those, there's the 4 learning styles.
Exactly. So the way that I hold it is this is evolution's engine that has these iterations. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's a transition, and then there's 1, 2, 3, 4 in the subtle tier, and then there's a transition, and then there's 1, 2, 3, 4 in the meta-aware tier, and then presumably a transition. And so the first parameter is receptive. This is the yin gesture. The yin.
And this is when we're coming into a brand new way of seeing the world.
Yeah. So a newborn, they're receptive. They're open. They're not zooming in. They're taking in. You see a little kid, maybe 1 year old. They're standing there and they're just receiving the world. And what we're doing is we're taking in the basic contents, the basic features of that reality without naming it, without categorizing it. We're just absorbing it like a sponge. And then the second is active. Once we've absorbed enough of it, we can start to manipulate it and get active with it. I can, for example, this is 1.5, a 2-year-old. Now I can actually manipulate the world that I've started to understand. I'm not just receiving and then hearing the word apple and receiving and hearing the word apple. I can grab the apple. I can bite the apple because I can run away with the apple. And then as this continues, once that matures to a degree, then we move into reciprocity, right? In the yin yang symbol, this is the line in between yin and yang. So we have the first is yin, the second is yang, and then the third is this the middle, the space in between, where
Which
yin
is
and
also
yang,
is also green, right? That's also 4.0.
that's also 4.0. Exactly.
Yeah.
So we can start to see that the stages model has octaves, because
Right,
this
right.
right-hand column iterates. We can see that 1.0, 3.0, and 5.0
5.0.
have an octave relationship. We can see that 1.5, 3.5, 5.5 have an octave relationship. The same with 2.0, 4.0, 6.0, and then 2.5, 4.5, 6.5. They all
Fascinating.
share a lot of similarities. What's different is the world space. What's
Right.
different is the
So
reality that they can see.
I interrupted you. So I mean, you said that it was receptive, active, reciprocal, and then there's a fourth that you didn't mention yet. So
Yeah,
just
so reciprocal is the relationship. This is the we. This is the we space. The pronoun we arises here, where there's a relationship between yin and yang. I can give you something, you receive it. You can give me something, I receive it. And we can go back and forth. And then the fourth is interpenetration. Interpenetration in the yin yang symbol is the dots, right? So I can see, well, I can look at you and I can see myself over there. And you can look at me and you can see yourself over here. And so in the concrete context, I can look at what's sitting on everybody's plates and I can see, oh, everyone is eating vegetarian. And then I can see on my plate, oh, I'm eating vegetarian too, because we're the same and we have the same belief system around how you're supposed to eat if you want to be spiritual or whatever it is. So that's concrete interpenetration. We all start to look the same.
And that's that interpenetrative is the very last stage of each here.
That's right. Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Which would be right. So that will be, as I'm at 2.5, mature amber in the integral model, I'm interpenetrative, where I'm noticing myself and I'm noticing others, and I'm in a constant back and forth between those two things.
My identity has become the collective identity. I'm one with it. You hear this in cults and in religions where you ask somebody like, what's the meaning of life? And everybody says basically the same thing. What does a good person do? Everybody says basically the same thing. And so by this point, you have developed a mature individual. You've developed a mature individual within a mature collective. And now the individual identity has started to become imprinted with the beliefs of the collective. Now, if we look at this in the context of 4.5, the way that this shows up
And
is
this is teal,
teal.
mature integral. Yep.
Exactly. This is teal. The way that this shows up in teal 4.5 is recognizing projection on reflection. I say, well, you're being, you're like a really shadowy expression of the king archetype. And then an hour later, I'm reflecting and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I'm being a shadowy expression of the king archetype. And so that's how we begin to interpenetrate with the subtle collective, a collective that's filled with contexts, a collective that's filled with archetypes, parts of the self. I can start to see everything out there is also in here. All the stages of development I see out there, they're also in here.
Yeah. Well, one of the ways I've tried to understand this and present it hopefully correctly to people is to say that, 3.5 orange, there's a robust understanding of the reality of cognitive bias, which is that, okay, like, I have a bias, and if I'm doing an experiment, I need to have a double blind or triple blind study to make sure that my bias, which I can't control, doesn't muck up the results.
Yeah.
And at 4.0, the next thing I would say it's sort of like, well, okay, there's a cognitive bias, but it's writ large culturally. So there's a subtler cognitive bias where we all have opinions about people of color. We all have opinions about women, and we may internalize those things. And so it might be a group of people of color that are actually acting in a way that is against their own interest on a certain subtle level, because it is this bias that's been programmed on this subtler level. Would that be another way of sort of understanding that in your understanding of the model?
Right. So where 3.5 orange is going to be looking at, to use your words, a cognitive bias, or to be able to really understand my mindset. Like that's a common 3.5 word. Like I've got a particular, so you can hear the active ownership. I have a mindset that is setting me up for success, right? That's a 3.5 statement, right? I have a mindset that is setting me up for success. 4.0 is going to expand that. And as you pointed out, start seeing larger cultural forces that are shaping us. They are shaping us. It's shaping me. I'm had by it, but I can see that there's a system that's doing that. Now, 4.5, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's where, like, in a lot of the green theorists, Ibrahim X. Kendi, and the whole anti-racist idea is that because you and I are both had by the system, we have to fight actively against it all the time.
Right.
Right?
Whereas,
We have to throw elbows every breath, and if we're not throwing elbows every breath, then we're had by the system. Ergo, we're creating a racist subculture, whatever.
right. Whereas someone like Carlos Hoyt, which I think is coming more from a 4.5 framing, is looking at saying, well, hold on a second. This whole thing of race is socially constructed. Do we want that? Do we want that lens? And we can start to see, 4.5 can start to see, okay, this particular lens is one of many lenses. And is it the best lens in terms of what it's going to produce in
Right.
collectives? And so
Right.
he proposes, he questions the very premise of the entire race conversation and tries to create a new context within which we can ask different questions and look at the whole thing in a different way. And what I see him doing is actively starting to manipulate the system in a positive way to try to get a different result in culture.
And what is 4.0 trying to do? They're not, I mean, they would certainly argue they're trying to impact the system.
Oh yeah, they are trying to impact the system.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's just they're trying to impact the system from inside the reciprocal dynamic.
Okay.
So it's like,
Yeah, maybe actually that's a great thing. Maybe from this idea of learning style, like, let's talk about this with this example. Okay. Systemic racism is a thing. So we start at 3.0 and we end 4.5 in the subtle.
Mhm.
So how is that held with that learning style?
yeah, okay. So I'll give a try.
Yeah. Put you on the spot a little bit there.
It's okay. It's okay. So firstly, 3.0 is emerging out of a concrete collective of rules and roles. So in our scenario here, we have to decide, well, what rules and roles are they stepping out of? Let's just make something up. They're in a traditional setting where maybe there is some black and white thinking, where people are categorized and described in sort of concrete ways. This person has this color skin, they act like this. This other person has this color skin, they act like that. So then 3.0, they are entering into a receptive state where they're beginning to receive impressions from a subtle mind that they don't quite understand yet. So here we can suppose that they will begin to be able to make a differentiation between what I think and where I grew up thinks. So there's an ability to do that, but at the same time, ideas can be coming in like rain. They can be streaming in like in a way that's hard to capture. So we may see a theory of race. We may not. We may see a questioning of the previous structure, which is a common thing that 3.0 is going to do.
Because it's receptive.
Because it's receptive.
And that's why in 3.0, we also see people really looking to experts, right?
That's right. That's right. So there also may be influence from when they go to college, and all of a sudden they're getting in all this information about, maybe it's a postmodern.
From experts. Yeah.
From experts. And then the question is, do they create a new concrete collective of rules and roles around this? Does it spark their own ideas? Well, I don't agree with where I grew up. I agree with sort of what this teacher said, but not all of what they said. I think maybe I'm starting to come up with this idea. 3.5 is going to be able to get more active with it, right? So they're going to be clearer about who they are as a subtle individual, what they think, what they're feeling, how that's impacting the way that they're engaging in the world and how that impacts the world. But they still have a concrete collective. So their focus may still be on, can be on concrete features of someone's body, because when they look at a collective, they see a group of people. So they still could be unnecessarily categorizing people by race. Then 4.0 is going to see, well, actually, this is not just a bunch of individuals with mindsets.
It's collectives.
It's a collective context that we're all soaking in. And there's a recognition that, okay, there's this systemic racism is making us see, if you look at, the media and how the media portrays a person of color, and you look at the legal system and how all of these and the world of marketing and advertising, especially if we're looking, it's still there now, but it was even more prominent earlier on, where someone with darker skin was portrayed in a very negative way, especially men.
Mhm.
They were portrayed in a very certain way that was on purpose. It was a marketing campaign.
Mhm.
So 4.0 is going to be able to see that the whole culture is being influenced by this system that's giving us bias,
Right.
that's giving us racial bias.
Right. And then they
And
can very easily lose the individuals and the collectives, right? All Black people are
Right.
equally victims of racism, which is like,
That's right.
maybe not, right?
Right. Yeah, and we start to see that for sure. And so there can be um, a lot of work to try to change the system from within it,
Mhm.
but we're still had by it to a certain degree. So there's certain limitations. Whereas 4.5, I mean, 4.5 has its own limitations, but 4.5 is going to be able to start looking at developmental structures within culture. That it's not just necessarily there's a whole system of racial oppression. Yes, we can acknowledge that. But we can also see that there are different stages of development that are seeing the world in different ways. And if those stages of development have power and then express shadow, then that's also going to bring forward other tones, other notes in culture. And so
Right.
there can be a way that 4.5 can get more active with trying to meet every stage where it's at and also rectify the shadow to try to support a healthier collective.
Right. And that's the interpenetrative.
Ye-
That's the dot on the yin and yang where I can acknowledge that, like, okay, I see a lot of the truth of what you're saying, but let's really unpack this and look at the nuance of it. I want to really I want to steel man your
Yeah.
argument. I want to both and your argument. I want to show where we're in agreement and where you can learn perhaps
Yeah.
that you might be doing unintentional harm by how you're holding things.
And then how do we go into schools, for example, and really support how children learn based on their developmental stages,
Right? Wouldn't that be something?
irregardless of the color of their skin, but recognizing the realities of how the system has impacted certain demographics,
Right.
but then coming in with a developmental lens and saying, okay, what's needed for developmental wellness for each group of children, and then creating a curriculum around that to
Right.
meet them as they grow. And um, yeah.
Beautiful.
So
Okay. Mhm.
I was just going to say, just to kind of bring us back to the beginning,
Mhm.
um, just to give a summary for folks, in this larger question of like what makes stages different or how is it useful in the developmental for folks that are interested in development. We can say that one of the gifts of Terry's stages model is its capacity for precision in the moment
Mm.
with human beings so that we can better meet, love, care for, and
Mm.
understand the human beings we're interacting with. In order to do that, we have a series of 3 questions. The first question is, what reality do they see? And this subdivides our 12 developmental waves into groups of 4. 4 concrete waves, 4 subtle waves, 4 meta-aware waves. Then the next question is, okay, I've narrowed this down to 4. Do they have a collective preference or an individual preference? And we see that the first 2 stages of every tier are developing the individual of that world space. And the second stage, the second 2 stages of every tier are developing the collective within that world space.
Mhm.
Then the third question, so that narrows it down from 4 to 2. The
Mhm.
third question, what is their preferred learning style or what aspect of evolution's engine is foregrounded in their experience? This now narrows our 2 down to 1. We've got receptive, active, reciprocal, and interpenetrative. And so in that way, we can work with the deep structure of the stages without getting too lost in content
Right.
and really pinpoint, aha, this person is coming from this, I would suggest this developmental range rather than they're at 4.0. I'm more interested in, oh, they move between, 3.0 and 4.0 um, as we're speaking.
Right.
This gives
Right.
me a
Because
range. Yeah.
right, because that's something, I mean, it's something I've seen you demonstrate, which is really neat, but just how in any given, say, paragraph of me speaking about something that, say I'm concerned about, the capacity to see that, like, I might be coming from 3 or 4 different stages depending on what the subject matter is. And those could all be healthy, right? I think there's another misunderstanding with integral, which is that, well, if I'm 4.5 teal, then I'm always talking teal. But, as you said at the top of this call, when I go to walk and open my door, I'm not using a fourth person perspective. I'm using a first person perspective, the same as a toddler, right? Door, hand, turn knob, walk through, right?
Ex- ex-
Um,
Exactly. And, this is where this is probably for a whole other discussion. But one of the things that Terry discovered was how these parameters are expressed through language, that uh, language is generative and it's an extension of cosmic becoming. And so when we're using language, the deep structures of our language, they reveal the deep structures of how we make meaning. And so, as you pointed out, we may be listening to someone, and in one full sentence, maybe 3 or 4 sentences, we might hear 2, 3, 4 stages in those 4 sentences, which, yes, if we wanted to, we could say, okay, I think as a whole, this person's coming from 4.5. But what's even more exciting, at least for me, is that we can hear literally in the moment how 4 stages are enfolded
right.
in one 3 or 4 sentence expression. That it
Right.
literally is how we talk about things
Right.
when we're expressing ourselves, that many of these waves are coming forward at the same time or in concert with one another.
Yeah. Yeah, which is sort of obvious and beautiful and healthy. And I know in some of the conversations I've had with Terry, one of the things that she's watches out for is if people get assessed and they're too top heavy. If people are sort of straining to make sure that they do everything through a higher, so-called higher level perspective, that's actually really a sign of not healthy development in some ways.
Yeah, and it also can be a sign that, like, I've got 36 sentence stems and I want to get a good score because my developmental community has told me that a higher score is better.
It's better,
So
right?
I'm going to try to answer every one as complexly or as advancedly as I possibly can. And we can use the test that way, but it doesn't show us the person's, if we do that, it doesn't show us the full sort of range that, when I said goodbye to my daughter today, I said, I love you, honey. And she said, I love you too. I didn't say, like, you are a nested, unfolding world of cosmic efflorescence. I do that if I want to get an eye roll, but it can be occurring in the context of you are an arising, unfolding cosmic efflorescence. But all I'm actually saying is like a 2 point, I love you. She goes, I love you
Love you
too.
too.
Like, see you soon.
Basic reciprocity.
Basic reciprocity.
Beautiful. Well, Jerry has a question here. Can you give an example of how language can express multiple stages in a short period of time?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm thinking about my sadness, and it makes me feel joyous because when I consider this, what it also brings up for me is that there are many aspects of myself that are rooting for me to build a better relationship with my emotions.
Mm,
So that was an example of 2, at least. I started with 3.5. I'm thinking about thinking. I'm looking at my thoughts. I'm looking at my feelings. I'm having feelings about my feelings. But then I moved into 4.0. So when I look at my thoughts, I feel really happy because I've been trying to learn how to have a better relationship with my thoughts. There are many aspects of myself that often pull me away from a positive relationship to my thoughts. And I notice that each of those aspects of the self are different ages. Some are more complex, some are less complex. So what I want to do is root in wholeness and have that be the organizing center from which I work with these different parts until they're all on board in supporting me to have a positive relationship with my thoughts. So I started with 3.5
Yep.
and I went into 4.0 and then I
Yep.
went into 4.5.
Yep. Great. It's a great example. It's a great example. And again, it speaks to the beautiful complexity is working with someone and being very careful in how we might want to assign how someone makes meaning, because it's, there's 3 levels right there. And if
That's
I'm
right.
not careful, I might latch on to the opener
That's right.
or just latch on to the closer and miss that, like, okay, there's at least 3 levels that are being expressed here. Well, that might warrant some more questions if I'm sort of new to this practice.
That's right. And to me, underneath that is Terry's stages model is an invitation for us to stay in a listening space.
Right.
Because if I stop listening and I extract myself from the dynamic and I start creating my own ideas about what stage someone is at, I'm actually no longer in a place of intimacy in the dynamic. I've separated myself and I've come to a conclusion, which is what I see happen more often than not.
Yeah.
What this
And then
does,
you're projecting, right? That's part of the problem.
and then you're
Right?
projecting. You're
Yeah.
projecting your own, usually it ends up that we end up projecting the parts of us that are at an earlier developmental level that we haven't embraced and loved deeply enough.
Mm.
And what Terry's model does is it gives us rigor and tools
Mm.
that really, though, invites just deeper intimacy. I have to stay listening because, my 16-year-old, she could say something from 2.0, then 2.5, then 3.0, then 3.5, and it's only been like 3 minutes. And to me, that's more around how people are unfolding. They're unfolding in a range that slides
course.
around a little bit.
Right.
And we've got so accustomed to this, where am I at? I'm at teal and I need to get all the green folks up to my level.
Right. Boy, that's a common one.
We're missing so much nuance.
Right.
That even the person at teal over the course of a day is moving through a number of different stages based on shifting contexts.
Sure.
Because
Sure.
we become with each other.
Right.
And so who we are changes when we're in different relationships.
It's beautiful. So I had a whole agenda here, which was to get into 5.0 and spiritual states. But I think if you're up for it, Alexander, we would just maybe have that on a different call, because I think this
Sure.
is a really good,
Yeah.
because it's relatively straightforward to 4.5. And then when we get into 5.0, the meta-aware, things start to get a little nuts and a little confusing. And I think there's a greater
Yeah.
chance that people, well, they might project all kinds of things onto that. So maybe we could just have a whole nother call and just really slow that down and talk
Yeah.
about, for me, one of the things that really does make Terry's work unique is this integration of Wilber's states of consciousness with stages of ego growth. And what happens as we transcend out of teal or integral and into turquoise and begin to, awareness begins to become aware of itself in a way that has just profoundly beautiful implications for how we see the world and ourselves.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. I'd love to have that conversation.
Awesome. Okay. So if anyone has any questions here, feel free to chat them in or to use the options at the bottom of your screen if you would like to call in. And anything else that I've missed or anything else that's sort of floating around for you that feels alive?
No, I think this is a really great sort of entry point into looking at some of the unique aspects of Terry's stages model and how it's very effective on the ground for the purposes not of evaluating each other. This is my agenda here.
That's all the smile.
But for the purposes of understanding each other. And when we look,
Evaluation versus understanding.
yeah, and one thing I'll just say is that if we look at the right-hand side of the model, the receptive, active, reciprocal, interpenetrative transition, receptive, active, reciprocal, interpenetrative transition, and so on, if we look at that as evolution's engine, that's where we see the unbroken continuity. that there's no breaks in this fabric.
Yeah.
There's no ladder here.
Yeah.
There's a fabric of becoming. And for me, when I see it that way, it immediately integrates the domains of process philosophy with like Whitehead, or we
Mm,
see Eastern wisdom.
mm,
It takes us out of noun orientation. You are a
mm.
noun and you are standing on this stair step, and it brings
Right.
us into process,
You're
which
greening right now,
I
or
what?
you're ambering right now.
Right. You're greening right now, you're ambering right now, and in order for you to green right now or amber right now, you needed everything that came before, including the entire world of life and the entire world of matter. That
Right.
we are an unbroken fabric from that whole thing. And I think as integrally informed humans, if we can start to embody a model like this from the perspective of process, the perspective of unbroken continuity, it fundamentally changes the place from which we are listening to other people, because we're
Mm,
really always listening to ourselves as a larger distributed collective that's
sure.
never been broken apart and is always in symphony with itself.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. So we have a few questions here.
Okay.
Okay, great. So okay, so we have let me just back up here. So how do shadow projection and empathy fit into this system?
Well, empathy can occur as early as 2.0. So empathy just means that I can, my mirror neurons are firing and I notice it. That when you're feeling sad, I feel sad in me. So we can do that as early as 2.0. It's not until 4.0 with help and 4.5, often also with help, that interest in shadow and shadow projection starts to come online. And I mention 4.5 also with help because I can't stress this enough. Someone can be have a center of gravity in 4.5 teal and have never read Ken Wilber. It's and so this is also why you can also have someone who has read Ken Wilber and thinks they're in supermind, and they're actually expressing 3.5
Or 3.0?
or 3.0. And so, um, yeah, so we can see here that the developmental structure can be present, but might not have the content we're all used to in it.
Right.
I've met people that have 4.5 capacities that haven't really learned much about shadow. I mean, that was certainly true for me. When
Right.
I was in 4.5 as a center of making meaning, I didn't know much
Likewise.
about shadow.
Yeah,
Um,
likewise.
but shadow projection tends to come up later, 4.5 and 4.0 if they're in a collective that keeps talking about it.
Right, right. Okay. Okay, so Roger wants to know what the best resource for going deeper with understanding and applying the stages framework might be. And one, I'd say, Roger, Terry O'Fallon and I are working on a book right now on stages, which should be out in probably 18 months, but that would be a whole book that would get into a lot of this stuff. But in the meantime, Alexander, what other resources are there?
Yeah, so I mean, what I would say, one is like, yes, Terry's book when it comes out. Another, you can go to Stages International and see what courses are there. There's some online evergreen courses. I teach a course typically in the spring on recognizing developmental stages. We work with videos and looking at movies and just playing with that. I'm
I've taken
also,
it. It's very
eh,
cool. Yeah.
yeah, it's a great course. And then also I'm working on a book that will be coming out sometime soon, which builds on Terry's research and situates it in a different way in terms of what the map looks like, but it's fundamentally the same
Hmm.
research and findings. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So Roger, the answer is, there aren't enough resources out there yet, but Alexander and I together are working to sort of see if we can get some more resources out into the world. And then Andrew has a question, which is, could you go over interpenetrative again, please?
Yeah. So interpenetrative is often the one that folks get the most confused about. I also like the word, Terry doesn't use this word, she used interpenetrative, but I like the word interreflective.
Mm,
also. So imagine that you're in a group of people, you're with a group of people, and there's a mirror in your heart, and there's a
mm,
mirror in everybody else's heart. And you can all see this mirror in everybody
mm.
else's heart. So when I look into your heart, I see my own reflection. And when you look into my heart, you see your own reflection. And so in this way, I'm giving more of a subtle interpenetration example. We're all the same, but we haven't collapsed into like a non-dual oneness. I'm still over here and you're still over there, but I can see that we're the same. We both have young parts in us that feel abandoned. We both have the amber stage of development in us. We both have the king archetype and the magician archetype. And so what starts to happen is it's the dots in the yin yang symbol. I'm over here in yin, but I look over there and I see a reflection of yin over in yang, and vice versa. Another way you can look at this is like two clouds start to pass through each other. At
Mm.
first, they're separate, but then they start to move together and they can start to see, oh, we're made from the same stuff. We both think that we should eat, steak to be real men, or we should be a vegetarian to like preserve our karmic future, or whatever the belief is. There's a way that we all share the same thing. We start to look the same.
Got it. And I can see where this would be confusing in some ways because, if you're looking to assess me, I'm also going to be speaking sort of all over the developmental map. So I might be speaking from a interpenetrative place, but it might be a much earlier interpenetrative place.
Right. And that's where we need to be asking the question of what's the world space that they have access to? Because what we
Right.
might see is they have access to a subtle world space, but only through the development of the subtle individual. But every time they talk about a collective, it's the people, it's the family, it's the rules, it's the laws. And so this is also a beautiful thing that Terry's model will illustrate is we can start to see, oh, they have access to a mature, subtle individual. And then what they see as a collective is a mature, concrete collective. What they don't
Mm.
have is a subtle collective yet. And
Got
that'll
it.
come on later with Green 4.0.
Got it. Okay. Okay. And then we'll do one more question here, which is from Pablo, which is what's the intent behind going through the three questions and getting a feel for where the other coming from in this specific model? So
Yeah.
what is
So
the intent? Yeah.
yeah. So the underlying intent is to be able to understand how someone is making meaning and what reality do they see. We tend to, we can, if we step back and look at the meta crisis, one way we
Mm-hmm.
can look at the meta crisis is that uh, there's an underlying myth of separation,
Mm,
right? We could call it a metamythic attractor. There's a
mm,
story, a narrative of that's rooted in separation,
mm.
that is sort of guiding how we live and what we do. And
Sure.
so we can say here that the underlying intention is to be able to understand, firstly and simply, that everyone is in a different reality. Even though we seem to be in the same world, we see different things. And not only that, we have a different perspective on those things that we can see. And so, first, if we just can admit that we don't all live in the same world and that the way that I see things is not the way that things are, this is Ken Wilber's myth of the given.
Right.
We can recognize that the way I see things is not the way things are. It then brings the next question. Well, how do you see things? What reality do you live in? What's important to you? And so by understanding these confluence of these three questions, um, I'm not so interested in what stage someone is at. As I've mentioned, I'm more interested in what range of meaning making is someone moving through. But the deeper intent is to understand someone more deeply so that I can love them more precisely
Mm,
and I can show them that I care in a way that m- feels meaningful to them. So if my daughter, when she was 7, is completely enamored with fairies, I'm not going to sort of put on top of her like a rational perspective of fairies don't
Fairies are
exist.
just a construct here.
Either fairies are just a construct or fairies are just make believe. Instead, I can live into the world of fairies with her
Right.
and support her in that concrete reciprocity
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
until that aspect of her becomes robust. This is the next intention. If we support and love people in a developmentally healthy way, it nurtures developmental wellness. When we get what we need developmentally, it nurtures robustness. So then this allows us to grow up, we don't grow up skinny.
Right.
Instead, we grow up full and rich. And it means that we're more oriented towards wholeness, which any stage can access, not just the later stages.
Sure.
Because we've been getting what we need, this allows us to have a predisposition towards being more curious about other people and more caring towards one another. So to me, that's the deeper intention.
Beautiful. And ideally then, like parenting this way or partnering this way, we don't have to do as much work on integrating some of these sort of fractured, disowned, messy selves, having a messy Amber or maybe a messy this or messy that, where, there's a lot of reintegration, reparenting, reattunement that has to happen to help make my development not skinny.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah. Beautiful. Okay. So great conversation.
Yeah. Love it.
Really enjoyed it. So we'll find a good time to talk, and we'll announce that, when this gets posted, we'll have our next sort of, whenever Alexander and I can carve out some time to have a second conversation on 5.0 and above.
Yeah. Love it.
And in the meantime, if people want to know more about you, want to work with you, where would they go?
Yeah, so there's two places. One place would be the eoslearningcollective.com. There's, you can find some other podcasts and ways.
Can you spell that?
Yeah, EOS.
Okay.
And then learningcollective.com. My email address is connection@eoslearningcollective.com if you want to email me with any questions or anything. And then also, you can always find me at the Newfield Network, which is newfieldnetwork.com. This is a global coach training organization focused on personal development. We're deeply integrally informed. I work a lot with supporting the creation of the curriculum there, and it's a fantastic organization. So that's the other place you can find me.
Great. Okay. So wonderful to talk to you, and we will speak again in the near future. And thank you, everybody, for listening and participating in the call. It's wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.